So I actually believe that the ongoing military activities in Gaza are complementary to the efforts to bring about the release of our hostages. Despite all of those concessions, with all of the complexities and complications that emanate from those concessions, we still have hostages, as I said, in captivity inside the Gaza Strip, being held in completely inhumane, unacceptable conditions. Whomever controls that aid controls the population. And we know that the United Nations workers that were operating inside the Gaza Strip in far too many cases were actually involved in the terror attack that took place, the massacre that took place on October the 7th. None of those normalization agreements prevented the October 7th massacre. The negotiations between Israel and Hamas are said to be ongoing, and it's worth remembering that the hostages who were seized by Hamas on October 7th have been languishing inside the Gaza Strip in horrific conditions for coming up to 650 days now. During the repeated ceasefire talks that were aimed at, among other things, releasing these hostages, Israel has made a great number of accommodations, and those accommodations include the resumption of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip supplied by and facilitated by Israel, something that was very controversial among Prime Minister Netanyahu's base and even more controversial among the base of some of his coalition partners. But the Prime Minister made that concession nonetheless in order to move negotiations forward. In addition, there were repeated rounds of ceasefires entered into by the State of Israel that were affixed in accordance with the religious calendar of the Muslim world and the population of Gaza. Remember that in 2024, Israel hung fire and did not go into Rafah even when it was ready to do so because it wanted to show deference to the religious Muslim calendar and to allow the people of Gaza to have some semblance of the holy festival of Ramadan, something that is juxtaposed with the complete desecration of the Jewish calendar by Hamas, as we saw by way of their invasion into Israel on October the 7th, during one of the holiest days in the Jewish year, Simchat Torah. But we did make that accommodation in order to try and bring some sort of ceasefire talks and hostage release talks to fruition. Beyond that, we have released many Palestinian prisoners, including terrorists with blood on their hands, of a category of notoriety that is on a truly global scale, again, in order to have our hostages released. And despite all of those concessions, with all of the complexities and complications that emanate from those concessions, we still have hostages, as I said, in captivity inside the Gaza Strip, being held in completely inhumane, unacceptable conditions. And we also have the bodies of dead hostages being held in a position of total purgatory, unable to be gathered into Israel for burial, unable to be reunited with their families for that burial, and able to be returned to the state of Israel. And it's against that backdrop that Prime Minister Netanyahu stated very clearly that any future rounds, including the current round of negotiations between Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire and for the release and the return of our hostages, those negotiations will take place tachat esh, under fire. So I actually believe that the ongoing military activities in Gaza are complementary to the efforts to bring about the release of our hostages. The Morag Corridor refers to an area that is north of Rafah and south of Khan Yunis, and it was hard fought and hard won by the Israel Defense Forces, the members of whom lost their lives in the campaign to open up this area. The Morag Corridor has a particular significance at this time because it is seen as an area into which the government of Israel wants to bring the preponderance of the Gazan population. It's in that area that population would receive humanitarian aid and sustenance and assistance. And it's everyone out of that area into which the Gazans would be moved that would be deemed Hamas terrorists. And against those terrorists, the IDF would operate with a view to eliminating them, making war against them, and taking them off the chessboard and off the battlefield. So the Morag Corridor is an area that is central to Prime Minister Netanyahu's mooted vision for tomorrow inside the Gaza Strip. Israel and the Israel Defense Forces, in my opinion, must not agree to a return to a situation where the United Nations are responsible for the distribution of humanitarian aid throughout the Gaza Strip, as is one of the requirements that Hamas is insisting upon during the course of these ceasefire hostage release negotiations. In very simple terms, the distribution of humanitarian aid really is central to Hamas's ability to continue to govern and to rule over the Gaza Strip. Whomever controls that aid controls the population. And we know that the United Nations workers that were operating inside the Gaza Strip in far too many cases were actually involved in the terror attack that took place, the massacre that took place on October the 7th. We know that. We also know that the United Nations has a vested interest in perpetuating the refugee, so-called, erroneously called, crisis inside the Gaza Strip and indeed in Judea and Samaria. We also know that they confer upon the Palestinians a completely unique status as refugees, namely that being a refugee is a hereditary title. There is no other demographic that continues to have refugee status once it has resettled out of a conflict zone or out of the land from which it was expelled or out of the land that it left of its own volition. Only in the case of the Palestinian Arabs does the United Nations confer permanent hereditary refugee status. So if we allow the United Nations to come back and take control of the distribution of aid, we are going to end up perpetuating this conflict between Israel and Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. Israel has to continue to control the distribution of the aid. It's a process that could do, in my opinion, with a degree of improvement, but it is very important that Israel doesn't cede that operation to the United Nations, because the United Nations work hand in glove far too often with Hamas. So the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington, D.C. really does seem to have successfully demonstrated the closeness of the relationship between him and President Donald Trump. Despite all of the conjecture and all of the theorizing to the contrary, it seems that these two men very much enjoy working together. And I believe that they also feel a brotherhood, if you like, around the controversies that they have each had to wade through or are wading through at this time. But I also think that the notion of normalization between Israel and some of its neighbors in the region was discussed as well. Normalization with the Saudis, potentially even an end to the status of enmity between Israel and Syria, and even there's an outside possibility that there could be normalization between Israel and Lebanon, of all places. And I just want to zone in on a couple of quick points. The first one is that with regard to Syria, Israel must not draw back from the areas it took in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Bashar al-Assad. In particular, we took control of the very peak of Mount Hermon there inside the Golan Heights. That is strategic, topographical advantage that we must not relinquish under any circumstances. It's also worth keeping in mind that al-Julani is an absolute acolyte of al-Qaeda. He is negotiating out of a position of profound weakness and profound instability inside Syria. Israel has a very significant, beloved Druze population within our borders, predominantly in northern Israel. Al-Julani wants the space and time to really eliminate the threat to his regime emanating from the Druze and from the Alawites inside Syria. Israel, because of its own Druze population, has a particular duty of care to the Druze population inside Syria. And so if there is to be an end to any status of enmity between Israel and Syria, it will have to be intrinsically written within that al-Julani will not be given any quarter to attack the Druze population inside Syria and, of course, the Alawite population. But in particular, Israel has a vested interest in protecting the Druze inside Syria. I also want to say that the notion of normalization has really been built up to something of a sacred cow here in Israel and by many people overseas who watch events in Israel. And I think that that's wrong, and I think it's inappropriate. And the reason is that normalization deals have not and were never designed to prevent terror attacks emanating from across the borders of the State of Israel into Israel, such as the one that we saw on October 7th. I remind everybody that we had normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and none of those normalization agreements prevented the October 7th massacre. And I make mention of that because it seems to be that the Saudis are expressing that in order to bring about normalization with Israel, there will have to be some sort of resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and there will have to be an end to the war against Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. Now, normalization with the Saudis might well be a virtuous goal, and people might well celebrate it if and when it comes to pass. But if the quid that Israel has to accept is normalizations with the Saudis, and the quo is that we establish a state for the Palestinian Arabs, I'm afraid that Israel, in my opinion, should resist that temptation. We cannot pursue amity, friendship, normalization with distant states with whom we do not share a border at the cost of sacrificing and relinquishing our security here in Israel as a consequence of an enemy still alive right across the border from us. And I want everybody to keep in mind that just this week, 5 of our soldiers were killed in the area of Bet Hanun by a Hamas ambush and by Hamas terrorists. Bet Hanun is approximately 3 kilometers away from the town of Sderot. This enemy is still alive, it is still dangerous, it is still managing to kill our soldiers. It must be destroyed, and I firmly believe that within the resolution to the quandary that is the Gaza Strip, Israel must advance with all due force and all due capability the implementation of the Trump vision for Gaza, because it is from among the Gazan population that Hamas draws and replenishes its ranks. It is from among the Gazan population that Hamas enjoyed popular support, including for the atrocity committed against us on October the 7th. And Israel, in my view, must not leave that population proximate to our borders. As long as it is, it will remain a threat to us. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and make sure you check out the Miriam Institute YouTube channel, where you'll find more analysis, podcasts, and incredible footage. If you want to see our very latest content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so that you'll get all of the relevant notifications. And we very much want to know what you think, and we want to hear the questions that you want answered. So please let us know in the comments. See you next time, and be sure to share this content with your network.